Hello and welcome to Information Revolution, a podcast for people who care about information management and related matters. I'm Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect in Wellington working for a small company called Metataxis.
I'm Michael Upton. I call myself an information management consultant, and I also work for Metataxis in Wellington.
And I'm Karl Melrose. I work for Castlepoint Systems in Canberra, but my views are definitely my own. So, Judi, what are we here for today?
Well, I'm glad to be back after having missed the last podcast,
which Things got a bit silly without you here.
which I listened to with great interest. The measuring effectiveness episode, and it made me think that I wonder what it would be like if you could start thinking about information management right from scratch, i.e., it's a new organization being set up. Hey, maybe we'll have, after the election, maybe we'll have a Ministry of Space here, since I think they want a Minister of Space. So let's say there's a new ministry being set up. What would the sort of things be that we would want to put in place in order to do that measuring effectiveness thing? Well, in order to create a good information management environment. But that would be a good opportunity, I think, to put things in place that would allow you to measure effectiveness, perhaps. And I was wondering, because normally we're dealing with things that are already there and how can we make them better? But if you had a chance to start from scratch, what would that look like? And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking the problem is that how much lead time do you have to this new ministry, whatever it is, being set up? Do you have time to do some thinking and putting things in place, or is it day one and hey, there's staff and et cetera, et cetera? So, I mean, there can't be staff on day one because if it's just set up, you've got to hire all these people. So hopefully that gives you a bit of time to think about what you need to put in place. But then you don't have all the staff there to help you with your thinking. So there's that, how much do you put in place without talking to the people who are going to be using whatever it is or working with the information? And how much can you put in place up front? What are the things you need to think about? And I think an obvious thing is, what are the goals of the organization and what would success look like for them? What is it they're trying to do? And how would information support that? How do we get them to think about how them, the management, how do we get them to think about how information would support that? Because that could be quite hard, I think. Coming at it from the information architecture perspective, I'd be in there straight away trying to draw a domain model, scoping out what the entities could be, therefore what the information is going to be about, probably. But what types of information are they going to be? What are the forms of records that we're going to want to create, and all those good things?
I mean, I think it's a good opportunity.
I think that's us. No, sorry.
I think it's a good opportunity to think about what is actually the goal of information management or records management or whatever we're going to call it in the organisation. What does the organisation actually want from it? And I was having a conversation with someone recently about data management, and I think there's a sort of, I mean, there's a life cycle to these things. I mean, I think that when everybody starts an organization and they kind of know where stuff is and what things are, and so they can operate relatively efficiently, even though they're creating a bit of a mess as they go. But then I think you end up, you get a certain distance down the road, and you just start to create more and more and more drag. And I think that more and more and more drag is the stuff that we'd all understand. We can't find things anymore. Which copy of that policy we're actually operating out of at the moment. It's all that basic stuff. But I think what are the goals of information management in the organisation? I mean, that's the first thing I'd want to sit down and talk to people about. I mean, if it's implement the Archives Act, then maybe some of us would be more interested in that than others. But I think reduce drag, reduce risk, and improve performance. I mean, I think those are definitely goals that I think a new organisation could get behind. And I mean, really defining the scope of what information management could be as well. Because, I mean, if you really are starting a new organisation and there are no systems, I mean, that just gives you a huge, it gives you the ability to start from scratch. And if you can define what information management is, and you can just say that, well, information management is how we create and manage the information of the organisation and manage business processes and those kinds of things. I mean, it could be everything from, okay, well, we need a HR, system of some kind. We need to hire, we need to be able to hire and manage all of these people. So what's the platform we use to do that? I mean, the scope could be dramatically different to what it is now. So that's the first thing I'd want to do. I'd want to sit down and say, what do you want? What do you want from us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the tension is that you've got to do something from day one in order to store the information about what the goals are, for example. We've had this meeting and we've discussed our goals. Oh, now what are we going to do with minutes from that meeting? So it's a real balance between making the long-term plan and the very, very short-term plan, the today plan as well. But yeah, absolutely. What does the organization think information management should be doing for them? What do they want from it? How does it support the ultimate goals of the organization? And of course, it depends on whether you're I don't know, a policy making body or um, a doer type of organization as to the kinds of things that you're going to be producing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting the idea of this is an organisation that started from scratch is an interesting one, because it does really, but when we kicked this question around last night, to say this is what we're going to do. I mean, my immediate thought was, well, I mean, you do what you do with any new organisation you start talking to. You literally kind of wander around and try and collect problems. That's what you do for an organization that's already operating. If they don't have an information management, if they don't have an information management team and infrastructure and those kinds of things, to me, you kind of wander around and collect problems, and then you sit down and say, right, what are the common capabilities that we need to provide a solution, to these basic problems that are kicking around? What are the sort of strategic things the organization wants to do? And then you design something that's systems and people and processes and all those sorts of things that that can deal with those problems and support the strategy. I mean, I think when it's really more of a question of support the strategy without having that base of problems, it's an interesting question, because it does leave me a bit flat-footed, if I'm honest. I mean, you start with basics like, where do we store stuff? But I mean, it was funny. I was going to throw out a tongue-in-cheek, oh, we'll just get Microsoft 365 and that'll solve all our problems. But you really are. The comment you made, Judi, about minutes and those kinds of things, I mean, you are talking about how organized people are in the way they go about their business and manage their business. And I know people who are serial and compulsive documentation creators, and minute absolutely everything, and nothing is complete until it's in a document. And then I know people who they pretty much operate on team meetings, and everybody gets together for a team meeting and there's a regular cadence of sort of accountability around that sort of thing, but they don't really write much down. And so I think which one of those organizations you find yourself in, I think, is going to determine a lot about how they value information management and how they think about it. And I think, unfortunately, the answer I'm going to say is it's situational and contextual. Michael, I think I cut you off.
I was just thinking, so I guess my experience with this is, firstly, I did some work when we had the Canterbury Earthquakes Recovery Authority, CERA, when that wound up after, basically it did what it says on the tin. It was basically trying to help the Canterbury region to recover, or New Zealand to recover from the impact of earthquakes in Canterbury. And yeah, so I got to see some of what happened. But from the outside, it would be really interesting to talk to people who were in there from the start. But it's a classic example where people pretty much had sort of at least a sort of almost like a de facto mandate to do whatever the hell they wanted technology wise, to just get on with it. And so people, I believe, were literally using, Gmail and so on, and just whatever, so that they could start communicating, and so they could start sharing information with each other while systems were being established. And so, that I guess in that situation, the classic thing that would happen is that I'll wind back. So I've done that. So I was involved in that from sort of seeing that at the end, and what do we do with the records of this in terms of um, successor agencies, so like transfer of functions to other places that were going to carry on the work, or needed to look after the records. And then the other thing I've done is I've been involved in 2 different royal commissions as the information manager, and so that is literally showing up in a room full of maybe only 2 or 3 other people. I was really grateful to be there that early and basically go, I think I'm going to do this. Is that what you want? And so it's really in line with what you're saying. And I guess probably more than talking about that first example with Sarah, I think probably talking about the Royal Commissions, what I found was that what worked for me was basically drawing a flow of an inquiry. And thankfully, an inquiry is very simple functionally. Like, what
Yeah.
does an inquiry do? It's one thing basically, in terms of if you wanted to break it down and function into activities. And then there's a few key activities, and they're to do with basically finding stuff out and writing a report, pretty much. And you could carve off the public engagement aspects as another part if you wanted. In terms of finding things out, you could split that up. But regardless, it's pretty simple in terms of it's not there to do many different things. It's there for a time-bound thing, and it delivers one output, really, which is, an inquiry report. And so I found that the key thing for me was that in terms of identifying those problems and things, it's a little bit like the, Ford's classic thing about if you ask people what they want, that ask for the faster horse. It's this thing where I actually have to tell people what they want.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's quite reasonable to expect that if you're in a, you know, I hate banging around the expertise word because it sounds a bit overinflated, but if you know a whole lot about one thing, you may as well say, "Hey, I reckon this is your starting point." And the worst case is that people, react badly to that, and then you find out, well, what did you think we were doing, or what did you think you need? And it still becomes the start of the conversation. Um, so the specific thing that I did in both cases with Royal Commissions, and what I often think about more generally when starting a piece of work, is principles, like saying, hey, I think these are basically principles we agree about how we're going to operate. So really, really basic high level examples of that stuff, like we're digital first, like the records of what we do will be digital. Just really basic
Yeah.
concepts like that. It might be stuff like, create once, share many times, those kind of concepts. I don't know, just whatever that
Yeah.
seems appropriate. Stuff about protection, for sure, information protection. We will protect, and what that means, try and get some bullets of what we think that is. And then it's what I really like about principles is there's not all the faff about policy. You can definitely there can be that need to get to policy, and I'm sure there would be for an ongoing organisation. But in the absence of um, sort of like sometimes you don't even have the approval mechanisms to actually meaningfully say, oh, well, this is how we're going to get to that formalization of this thing. So it's like, well, here you go. Here's some ways of thinking about some stuff. This is how I reckon we should work. And almost trying to keep it as casual as that. And then seeing how people respond to that. I've found that's really, really valuable for kicking things off. And the thing I also really like about principles is principles are kind of designed to say, um, these guide your thinking in the absence of the rules. So, like, we haven't got the rules yet. So these principles will help you make good decisions, and they're going to help me make good decisions about what we do next. So it's something you can do very quickly that gives you some idea of the direction that you want to go in, as opposed to, for instance, a strategy or a policy, which typically takes ages, or typically takes a substantial chunk of time. Yeah.
I love it. I should have just stopped.
Right.
Let you go. You're much more sensible than me. But I mean, that's it. It's funny that you say. I mean, because I, in the absence of a strategic idea, I kind of, well, I mean, that's what I immediately look for. It's what is that strategic idea, and then strategy, policy, governance, people, process, technology. I mean, everything kind of rolls out of that. But I love your idea about what are the principles that we agree on as kind of like the bedrock of. I love that.
Yeah,
That's brilliant. That's just
I'm,
really smart.
I totally agree. I'm wondering how the principles then would differ from the strategy once the strategy is developed. I mean, surely the principles will morph into the strategy.
To be honest, I like putting principles in strategy. I like,
Yeah,
I like saying,
me
you know,
too.
these are kind of the agreed principles that we work to, and making explicit that distinction between a rule and a principle, like it's basically a should versus must have, right? It's sort of saying, look, you know, this is how we think about things, and trying to force people not to work to the letter of the law, almost, trying to force people to embed a way of doing stuff, I guess. But also just being really honest that shit we don't know yet, like I think that's a really important thing about principles. But one thing I would say is that, I mean, when an organization is established, it is established for a reason. And so you've got something in terms of
Yeah,
a goal.
yeah,
If it's a Ministry of Space, it's like, okay, well, you're not going to be, I don't know, whatever, looking at food regulation or something, like you've
yeah.
got some kind of an idea of organizational direction. Um, yeah.
And you'll know what your outputs are supposed to be because that will be written into the formation of the ministry or whatever it is. So yeah, and I mean I liked your thought about the mapping of the process, and obviously it would be relatively simple for a royal commission, as you've just said. But yeah, doing that kind of mapping of, well, this is what we think we're here for. How do we get there? What do we think the steps are to achieving this policy, or to I don't know, doing this bit of regulation or whatever it is? Let's look at that process and then map what information we think accompanies those particular steps on the journey, are
This is
created
sounding very much like
by or
ISO
used by.
15489 Section 7 appraisal. My favourite section, appraisal.
Appraisal.
Oh, I
Yeah, I
see
mean,
what you mean. I see what you mean. Well, yeah,
it's a really sensible way to appraise information, right? Is to see where it fits in your processes and go, oh,
yeah,
okay, well, this looks really damn important. Yeah. And then, I
yeah,
mean, and you take that all the way back to why do we exist? It's like, oh, okay, we're holding this really important information on behalf of citizens, or,
This is a
whatever,
public asset we've been entrusted
Yeah,
with,
yeah,
and yeah.
yeah. And I think one of the challenges, if it's genuinely new, is that people get really caught up in, oh, we haven't figured that out yet, or we don't know. And so I guess there will always be a tension around how much detail you can get into for any given process. But I don't think that would hold us back all that much in terms of how you want to, what kind of structures are necessary to, make things run efficiently and effectively.
yeah. I hadn't when I started this question. I hadn't thought about the kind of lead time that you might need to get the technology in place, but of course that could be quite an issue. And there would be, I'm sure, a drive to just get something in, like, yeah, let's just get 365 in. And
Well, I mean,
so I think that would need to be covered by the principles in the first place somehow. Don't know how exactly, but
sure.
some level of governance, or some means of being able to make decisions along the way, or come to some agreement about it, even if it's not a final decision, but come to some agreed steps along the way while you're working all these things out.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes when I'm thinking about principles, one of the benefits I try and push is that if you can get some kind of an approver at the right level to say
Yeah,
yes, then you can say, okay, um, so do you also agree that if we stay within the principles, then we don't need to get your approval? Basically, when we're
good
doing
one.
further work, we can just carry on. And if we want to contradict the principles, any of them, perhaps, we'll bring it up the food chain for you to approve it. And so um, you might establish governance through
Mm.
writing the principles. That's what I was thinking, because you might
Yeah,
say, okay,
that's
here's a
nice. Yeah.
mechanism, and then you can go home. Nah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing in any small organisation, and every organisation starts out small, is that at least for a little while, the personalities of the people who are operating the organisation is the thing that drives,
Mm.
what
Hmm.
you can do, and that's this piece that's kind of wandering around in my head. It's what, and this was the comment earlier about how organised are these people that we're working with? Because if they're extremely well organised people who like to document everything and all that kind of stuff, then it should be a relatively straightforward process to give them something that's well organised. And the longer you can keep that going, the better things are going to be. But I mean, if you get people who operate based on we're going to have a team meeting every Monday and we're going to decide what we do that week, and we're not really going to document it, we're just going to get it done, you're in a very different situation. It's the only thing that I love your idea about principles, Michael. I think that's really, really simple but effective,
Yeah, yeah,
clever.
Yeah, it's I've just found it such an effective way to do something that's the right amount of effort. I think to sort of it's a great return on it. I guess like
Mm.
if you write these principles, you get it's a really clear gain from doing that. You've got some kind of a framework. You've kind of established this thing of like this is going to change. Like we're not sort of pretending that we're locked in. We're just saying, hey, you know, this is how we want to work, isn't it? And then getting agreement on that, and then building on it. Yeah, and I guess I may as well make it explicit that I think this is really useful in any context, but it's certainly really good when you're starting out on a piece of work, whether it's an initiative within an existing organisation or whether it's a new thing, a new organisation.
How do you
and
find
how,
they evolve over the life of the thing? Do you find they evolve, or do they get replaced by harder things?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, in a project context, I had a situation where, yeah, we actually just went, oh, this is all wrong, isn't it? About one principle. We'd established a principle, which I can't remember what it was now. It was something that, like, on paper, as it were, felt really obvious, like, we will keep things as simple as possible or something. I can't remember. And we just realized that the examples we were giving, that actually in practice we wanted to contradict this every time. And it's like, oh, okay. So, established governance mechanism, go back to the approver, say, hey, we're going to change this principle. And here's why. Yeah. Like it's basically because it's not true. It's not the thing that
It's
we
not
actually
working.
want to
It's not
do.
the thing we want. Mm.
Yeah. And it's not actually how we work, because it sort of starts to become a sort of a feedback. Or you can get feedback from it and go, oh, okay, well, actually, seeing how people are working and seeing that it's working well, that doesn't line up with what we said the principle was or how we articulated it. Sometimes it's just that. Yeah. Yeah. And it might be something, as kind of classic for our world, like that things should be open by default. It might actually be understanding that,
yeah,
oh, actually, we work in an incredibly I'll say sensitive, information environment, and actually things need to be very well protected. And actually, that doesn't line up with what we do in practice. Um, And so just because it's the received wisdom, it's not actually the principle that we're going to follow or that we are following now. So let's change it so that it's clearer for new people. Yeah. And I should say those principles, this is kind of just becoming the episode about the principles. I put them into induction, like show people as they arrive, hey, this is how we've agreed we're going to work with information. Yeah. What do you
you
think?
are establishing the culture through principles.
Mm.
And that's what I really like about it. It's a cultural mechanism.
So just going back to
instead of
your
faffing around with technology.
Yeah.
yeah, going back to
Yeah.
your discussions then from the last podcast, is it possible to put anything in place at this stage, at this very early stage, that's going to allow you to measure how successful you're being? Do you think? I mean, just
Governance already.
yeah, I think that's what I'm taking from what Michael's saying. Is that working? So if what you're doing fits in with your principles, then that's one layer of effectiveness, I guess. If you're constantly
Yeah,
testing
it's a bit
out
of a
what you're coming up with against those principles, that's a measurement.
yeah, for sure. I guess it's I think we had a flavour of this last time in terms of measuring effectiveness. Do you want to tie that back to the goals of the organisation? Are you trying to measure your effectiveness in the context of I can see that the organisation's able to do its work well, therefore we're being effective ourselves in the information and records. I don't know. It's a tricky one at the start. Yeah. I naturally go towards that thing of okay, we've figured out what we're trying to do, as in what the organisation is here for. These are some key processes. How well can those processes be completed? Which I guess is like an efficiency measure. But
Yeah.
This is where the established ways that people work becomes a really interesting challenge because you do the basic underlying problem of information management. You get one person to do some work and they kind of know how to do it and they put their stuff somewhere and they know where it is because they've put it there. Hopefully, occasionally you meet people who are so disorganized they don't even know where their own stuff is when they put it there. But then you
Occasionally.
get all the time. Then you get two people that need to know where that stuff is, and then you run into problems. And then the more people you get, the bigger the problem becomes. And I mean that's the problem of how do you scale that? And I love the idea of starting with principles because at the very least, you've got some kind of cultural mechanism where hopefully people will agree on what that stuff looks like. But and the but is, at what point do we have to go beyond the way people work? And I think, Michael, you said it earlier on. You talked about, you bring a lot of expertise into an organization. Well, how do you make sure that organization starts to consume your expertise as it gets bigger and starts to recognize the problems that it is creating because it doesn't understand, information management as well as you do? And how do you get that? How do you essentially get people to start agreeing that, yeah, okay, this is the way that I like to work, but this thing is bigger than me, and now we need to start working together. I mean, it's funny actually, because I've seen it in a number of small organizations. It's this transition from in a bunch of individuals doing their things to teamwork and, succeeding as a team. And, that's when the wheels fall off because there's a couple of, I mean, if you want to go and read, people want something to read, there's something called Greiner's growth model, which talks about the sort of stages that organizations go through in terms of their growth pattern. And it's really interesting because if you look at I've been in a couple of organizations that are going from these, sort of phase 1 to phase 2 or phase 2 to phase 3. And you can actually see the information challenges happening as you go, because you go from this very directive type structure where you've either got somebody who runs the company and they are very directive, or you've got this very entrepreneurial set of people who are all just kind of doing stuff together, and all of a sudden the level and type of organization needs to change. And when that happens, the way the information is passed between people and created needs to change. and people all of a sudden have to start talking to each other and saying, well, now I need this information because we've just broken this process into 2 bits, and I'm doing the first bit and you're doing the second bit, and people have to think beyond themselves. I mean, I think that's the fundamental organizational challenge. And I like the idea of principles because I think you'll get people thinking about that stuff, but how it happens in practice and how you can go around and make sure that your expertise is consumed so that you don't, so basically the organization gains from your expertise, and it doesn't start to that pattern that I mentioned right back at the start where I was having, data management conversations. You start out by doing a certain amount of stuff in a data management practice, and if you don't manage your data well, within a couple of years, the gains that you can get from the analytics start to be eaten up by the amount of time that you actually have to, spend fixing the data and making sure that you can actually consume it safely because you haven't corrupted it. You understand how it's defined, all of those kinds of things. I mean, I think what we're talking about is fundamentally the same thing, but how do you transition from a 3-person organization where, I need that thing, where do you put it? Oh, well, there's one person creating that, and I know they think like this, so they put it there, to now we're 300 people, and that transition. There's a lot of turns on that.
I mean, I think answer is the transition will be pretty lumpy and ugly. Like we
good, we agree
shouldn't.
on that.
We can't. I mean, I just think it'd be really silly to go into that thinking that like we'll somehow smoothly go from really small to substantially larger, because I just think it doesn't happen because it is hard, as you say. There's it's pretty much an aside, but that social thing of suddenly shifting from a situation where you know everyone to where you don't, where you suddenly realize there are people in your office and you're not sure who that person is or when they started. That's like there's a lot of. I think that's a really relatable example of how things suddenly start shifting in terms of practice or need to shift, because it's like, oh, okay, we can't rely on that thing where you just go and ask Karl, go and ask Judi, like it's like, oh, okay, where is the bit of the organization that does this thing suddenly, becomes more of a question as opposed to just, oh, we're all mucking in and there's maybe one person doing each thing. Yeah.
That would actually be a good thing to track, though. People going around the organization and saying, oh, hey, do you know where XYZ is? I mean, I think if I wanted to get a tenor on anything in the organization, it would be when other people are asking other people for information.
Right.
I'd want to, use my super invasive Snoopy AI to, anytime someone in the office, utters the word, do you know where? I'd want, I'd want the floodlights to come on and,
Yeah. I don't know how
Hooves
to.
to go off, yeah.
yeah, ding, just like, oh, I hear you've got a problem.
Nice. Yeah, I think, I mean, right at the start, you could say, well, nobody is allowed to do any kind of anything outside the principles or the very basic things that we're prescribing. You've got to do what we say at the beginning. Well, that's never going to work because now you've got 100 people or whatever it is. You're not going to know what they need, probably. And they're going to need to do it now. So they're going to find ways to do that, which are going to circumvent whatever it is you're doing. So it's finding a way to meet that, to I don't want to say combat it, because people need to do what they need to do in order to get the work done. But
and you can't
find
stop
a
them.
way to, and you can't stop them, and you probably shouldn't stop them necessarily.
That's
Because they've got to do their work. But yeah, finding a way to bring that all into the fold, to be able to make sense of it and make it part of your official information landscape. That's a real challenge. Interesting, fascinating.
But I think the make sense of, I think, you just use that phrase. I mean, I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. How do you make this organization something that people can continue to make sense of, as it's at, 2 to 3 people, as it's at 23 to, 20 to 30 people, 200 to 300.
But yeah, trying to keep some level of control of this and help it to develop in a managed way rather than just whatever, is the key, I would say. but not that easy necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, control's an interesting.
Yeah, maybe
I always
control
find control being an interesting idea.
support, maybe?
Yeah, well, I mean, I like
Yeah.
the idea of
I don't
support.
know. I think a bit of control too, personally.
I
I
was
think there'll be
talking to
times it's necessary. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking to a CIO once, and it was a series of interviews for something I was doing, and it would be great to go back and rewatch them because there was a quote in it that I loved, and it was he'd been very supportive and very help and everything else, and he said I love the carrot, but in my heart I believe in the stick, and it was just it was just this great kind of
Yeah.
or in my heart I reach for the stick first or something like that. Like it was just a fantastic moment where I think control is a really interesting control's a really interesting idea, but I think any control that we feel like we have is illusory. And I mean, ultimately, I think what we're finding out is that the level of control organizations have over their people,
Well,
unless you are prepared to be that
or
manager.
control over the information flow, maybe, rather than over the people. Controlling the people sounds a little bit or too
Yeah, I think
negative.
Yeah, but I mean, controlling the information flow, I mean, I've worked in lots of organizations that, have tried to control the information flow, and, I've watched the ways that people work around it, and it's just,
mm,
people pick the phone
I
up,
reckon
they use paper,
yeah.
it's,
I loved back in the day, I mean, like before all the sort of cloud products and things. I remember someone working in an organization where they rolled out an EDRMS that forced you to save into the EDRMS, like stopped you from being able to save to your desktop, and finding a, let's say, seasoned staff member who actually just refused to save after that and just printed and then just closed the documents. Like
Oh,
basically
wow.
lost the electronic document because for her that was a better use of her time than faffing around with the compulsory metadata fields. Yeah, it's always
that
stuck
is
in my head.
amazing.
I mean, that's I don't know how long ago that would be. It's probably about 2007.
The point I just wanted to make about that control idea was just that I think
Mm,
if you are there, I think if you let people make a mess, and then if you can go and help them create a higher quality information environment that genuinely makes things better for them, I think you can get a virtuous cycle started where you're not going to have to do that too many times before they're coming to you and saying things feel like a mess again. And I think that cultural mechanism, I think that's a lot of what we're struggling with in information management at the moment. I think what we're struggling with in information management at the moment in lots of organizations is a history of people coming to us and saying, hey, we need help with this, recordsy, information-y type problem. And we say, great, just put it in the EDRMS. And a lot of the
our
time,
one answer.
what they've come to us with is to say that the EDRMS makes our life a pain, and we want to burn it down. And people will often use WIFM here and say, well, what's in it for you is more efficiency and public integrity and all these great things that you should want. And all you've got to do is put it in the EDRMS that you've just told us you want to set fire to. I think helping there. I don't think anybody on this call has that or that sort of approach, obviously, but I've seen it happen a few times.
What I find in kind of in the work kind of situations I've been describing is that the challenge really is the thing that people have been saying, like that you've both been saying, that how to get into those problem solving sessions and how to inject expertise or how to demonstrate expertise and how to um, do that in a way that does allow people to feel organised and make sense. And, all these things that we've been saying, I guess all I really wanted to emphasise is that it so lines up with the things I find hard or, that I find a challenge. Um, and that, and I think, yes, that would still be tricky if you were establishing a new organisation. Um, it's um, people do naturally, I think, want to solve those problems for themselves in a team and in a new organization. They're like, right, well, I'm here to do this thing. I'm here for the first time, so it's on me to figure this out. Like, say you've got some policy function. It's like, okay, I'm going to figure out how we do policy here. And so how is it that as an information person, I can be in those conversations? I can be shaping them to some extent, going, hey, I know how this goes, like this will explode if we go this way, versus what you're describing, Karl, of going, all right, over to you, go for it. And then I will come in afterwards and go, how's that played out, and how could I help you make that better? Yeah. I think in a brand new organization, if you're in early enough, you probably would have a greater opportunity to basically just show up to those kinds of sessions where people are first establishing how they want to work. And then it would be about supporting those people, or even kind of going away with your action list and saying, hey, this is my job. My job's to go away with these aspects of this. I'm going to go figure those things out for you, and I'll come back to you. And it might be as simple as, I'm going to figure out where you save that stuff, or I'm worried about how I don't know, how you'd actually find that stuff again, or I'm worried about how this scales. I'm going to go and look at these things.
I think the scale appropriate way to do all these things. I mean, I think that's the ultimate challenge. I think the thing is that whether you are there for those first conversations or not, I think you create these problems as you go, because I have worked in organisations of that were quite small, that tried to organise their information in anticipation of being a 10,000 person organisation, and it's just a disaster, because people will not go to the level. There is extra effort to organise information like that, because you are organising for scale, and people just won't go to the extra effort. If I could look at any problem with records programs in lots of government organisations, it's that the same program gets rolled out in a 10,000 person organisation and a 20 person organisation. So, I mean, how you respond in a scale appropriate way, because the response will be different. People are going to bring in their own ways of working, and there is going to be a way to organise the information they create and need to create that is appropriate to that way of working, and then to the scale the organisation works at. As that way of working changes and the scale of the organisation changes, I mean, you're going to create a mess. And the mess, we're not going to think about a mess, because it's going to be a well-organised information set if one person is using it and they understand it. But to 10 people who are now trying to use it, it's going to look like a mess, because there's 10 different ways that each one of those people can organise their information and wants to. I mean, I actually think it would be interesting to do some research about some of this stuff, but I think one of the biggest predictors of engagement on this would actually be, you've got new people coming into the organisation. What was their engagement with their information management team in the previous organisation? I think that'd probably be your best predictor of, your ability to engage.
I think in the inquiries I've worked on, I'm just seen as the tech person. I'm seen as the IT person.
Oh, that's
which is
kind of ideal in some ways.
Because in a very small organisation, they're not going to have a service desk of their own or something. And I am comfortable. It's not about being kind of a giant techie. It's more just like, okay, I'm comfortable having a go at something and hacking about with some technology. And how do a bunch of these information management things actually surface in practice? It's kind of, I'll show you what to do on your computer. And so people might think of me as like, the technical expert.
So that's been quite wide-ranging, really. I think the principles part of it has come out really strongly, certainly for me. And then although having those first conversations, or making sure that you're at the table having conversations as the organisation grows, seems to be, and if you've got those principles behind you, which have been agreed at the top level, as you say, that sounds like a pretty solid approach. Whether or not it's going to work or not depends on exactly the nature, the size and nature of the organisation. But it sounds like a really good place to start. So might be a good place to stop for today, and see you all next time on the Information Revolution podcast.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, all.
Bye.